Hi, I'm Shannon Leitz. I am one of the founders of DevSecOps. A little bit about me. I've been working on Software Safer Sooner for quite some time. Started in the industry as a developer slash security professional. Um, I like to build comic strips and also recently started something called Hacker Girl. And I think you'll see more about that as I continue to ramp it up with some of my cohorts in the industry. So, super excited to be here. I'm a big fan of Mark Miller, Derek Weeks, Sonatype, lots of fun that we've been having over the years, and want to talk a little bit today about DevSecOps. I thought I'd get started with something that Simon Wardley sort of invented, which is a Wardley map, and wanted to talk about a little bit about like what the heck is happening out there. Why is this red teamer talking about Nexus? Like, what is going on in this world? And so if you kind of look at a Wordly map, what it helps you to understand is sort of how to predict the future. And what's great about that is for people like me, it sort of explains the genesis of ideas. I tend to be on the bleeding edge of things and always end up feeling like people don't quite understand. So you can imagine that trying to make things come together is really about telling a story. And in this case, when you're building a story around things like CI/CD and the changes that are coming with the cloud, you really kind of hone in on where pain points start. And while most pain points started with traditional compute and building applications and data centers and how slow things were coming about, and just from the standpoint of application development, customers demanding better things and more stuff. And so you can imagine that that meant that Agile got born in the early 2000s. And well, that had a profound effect on compute, one that was actually really interesting. Agile basically needed the ability for us to publish code faster. And so the pipeline of what is now the cloud actually got started. So a little bit of automation here. And so compute kind of translated into cloud. From cloud, we ended up basically shifting in terms of security. And so there's a profound effect between the cloud and DevSecOps and Agile and some of these different things that have been happening. I'm also a big fan of DevOps and really trying to figure out how to build better practices around application development. I love the idea that we can actually connect the dots between development and operations, 24/7 capabilities. And so, if you kind of build on from the fact that compute didn't work, cloud got born, you also saw shifts around compliance, and now compliance as code is really becoming the bigger thing. You're seeing some of the cloud providers out there like AWS, GCP, and Azure include more security capabilities that are around compliance measures being built in. And that's a big advantage because compliance is really difficult. There's lots of requirements, and trying to make sure that we're doing the right things in our applications is really important when you're dealing with regulations. Another thing to think about is like penetration testing really kind of is an interesting concept. There's been a lot of that over the years. I've been in this industry for like 30 years, so you can imagine I've seen it all. And when that stopped working with some of the ephemeral workloads, because a point-in-time assessment is not all that great when you're doing code deployments on a daily basis, red teaming became sort of an interest and an attraction. And there's ways to practice red teaming. I would say we do extreme red teaming. We're kind of a red team X, if you will, where I work. And so I think that this is really becoming more of the norm. And you'll see a lot more red team tools emerge and some of the commoditization there. And then, finally, like traditional security really has been working its way towards DevSecOps over the last couple of years. And we're seeing more and more practitioners really understanding that for them to do the right things for their organizations, to have software safer sooner, you've got to start to lean into the development and CI/CD pipelines, which sort of transcends. And I would say that this also gave me a pause back in the day when we started doing some of this work across many of the companies I've worked at. And so the way that I look at this is it was very much at the time that it started, sort of something that went from this checklist of things that people had to do in security towards this moment of realization that the checklist wasn't working, that things couldn't just be figured out, that somehow we actually had to emerge. And really that gave pause to the head banging moment, if you will, that led to sort of this evolution in thinking from a security perspective, and really is the reason why we started DevSecOps. um, I can tell you that a lot of the angst, the heartache, I wish there had been some people that had gone before us, because we really learned the hard way that it required us to think a lot different as security practitioners. And over the years, I've gotten a chance to work with a lot of great security practitioners, and some of them have said, well, with DevOps, security has really kind of gone by the wayside. And one of the greatest things that I've heard recently was, John Willis talking about how security is just too important to leave out of DevOps. And so the natural evolution to DevSecOps is something that we really need in the industry, in the software that we build, so that we can start to really evolve our capabilities, meet more of the customer demands that are out there, and also make sure that we're also building in the trust required to keep those applications alive long term. So if you kind of follow through this thread, the head banging moment occurred. So really what emerged from that was, well, what if we start thinking about how we're going to evolve over time? And so the natural evolution started with sort of the burp, or what do we call kind of the insanity moment of lots of surprises. Skills need to be developed for every job function. Developers had to build security skills, and security had to build dev skills, and well, ops had to build all of those. So did everybody else have to build ops skills. And so you can kind of imagine this is an emerging capability that we've all been thinking about. The maturity model that you're seeing here is really around behavioral maturity. When you're in an environment, you could say what the things are to prescribe, but in reality, the truth is that you'll know you're living in an environment that's actually maturing from a DevSecOps perspective when you really start to see the culture shift. There's a lot more context and decisions. People are talking about security, but they're not just saying security. They're talking about things like kill chain. They're talking about CVEs, proof of concept code, exploits. And, executives are part of that process. Your company's evolving when you start to see some of these things come to life on a daily basis, part of your OpMex. And why is that all really important? Why is that part of a Nexus conference? Well, I think the reason why is because when it comes down to it, software gets built by developers. I would say that I got started as a developer. I quickly shifted over to security because it became just super interesting for me. I'm kind of a anti-engineering person. I like to break things. I'm also a creative, which means I like to break things in weird ways. And so you can imagine that lent itself to building a really big, extreme red team here into it. And what that allowed us to do from an emerging perspective is to look at things in a little bit of a different way and kind of shift towards looking at the CI/CD pipeline. So this is a picture I've put up many years now. And what I'd say is, like, how hard could it possibly be to put security into a CI/CD? And there's lots of code capabilities out there. You have to, build your code. You have to basically deploy it, and somewhere in here, a security professional has to figure out how they're going to map all their security capabilities into it. And so the cool part about a CI/CD pipeline is there's lots of products that you could choose, but a lot of them are one for one on this process of being able to develop code, be able to integrate it, test and scan it, build and deploy it, and really monitor it. And so the end-to-end lifecycle is pretty clean when it comes to having lots of options for products that are out there that fit into this pipeline. On the counter side, the security side is kind of messy. And so if you look at DevSecOps as code pipeline and putting trust back into your code, there's a lot of myriad of tools, and they have to kind of be strung together. And there's lots of very small patterns around how code becomes security degraded over time, and how you're going to actually spot inspect security degraded code is really a challenge. Figuring out and moving and shifting left is really about shifting your mindset left, as opposed to thinking that you're going to make something perfect and it's going to travel down the pipeline with speed. That may not actually be what we're talking about when it comes to really evolving your practice around software being safe. And so the idea is, what spot inspections do you need to be able to deal with the code that you're building specific to your organization is part of the mindset of how you put things together. So, everybody said to me, well, you run a red team, which means you wait for this whole thing to get done, and then all of a sudden you're, pounding the snot out of code and you break it, and then it goes back through this pipeline. Isn't that the anti thought process of shift left? And what I've would have told people for many years is that actually a good red team is very early on in looking at source code early to look for exploitable code, building things like, we have something called Rebel that basically looks for exploitable code within source code repository, looking at how we're going to pull things together. So today what I wanted to do is, this is a Nexus user conference. I wanted to highlight the area around artifacts. And I think that that's a really important thing because there's a little bit of a nuance when it comes to a red teamer who thinks about what a pipeline looks like and how they might actually leverage the information coming out of something, say, like Nexus. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how does Nexus fit into the red team world, and why do we like it, and what does it do for us? The artifact repository is a #1 candidate for where you might find things that you can test and break from a security perspective. So it's a place where you have to have a really good secure repository, but secondarily, it's also a place where you're actually sharing between many different teams earlier than deployment, and it gives you the ability to share code that can be sort of broken into and then later that information brought to life. What's great about Nexus is they also have some products and capabilities that allow you to not have to have necessarily a huge red team to do some of these things. You can actually spot your capability inside of Nexus and then actually get information about whether or not the things that you have inside of your artifact are secure enough. And so I thought there was a great thought process around this, which is security is really about degradation. And I think repository for an artifact is really important because you can actually check to see how your code's performing by the way in which it's actually being evaluated. And since source code actually degrades over time and applications degrade over time, wouldn't you want to have the information that you need sooner than later to be able to evaluate within your pipeline when you're going to do a security recall? So you can imagine that means that a company that gets closer to its artifacts and is able to look for things like CVEs and interest from the community on those artifacts and the libraries that are being leveraged within software, it means that you're getting a little bit of a pulse early on ahead of when you might publish something that does have an opportunity. So we're really, we're very much adversary obsessed. And when you're adversary obsessed, things like this chart actually represent communal interest around a specific component part. And to look for component parts, you actually really have to have a different viewpoint. So for us, just kind of going to some of the Sonatype capabilities, there's a capability within the product that has the ability for you to see the vulnerabilities and security issues associated with your artifacts. And what's great about that is it gives you a threat level. There's an identifier for whether or not you have a CVE, or in this case, Sonatype also does some of their own research where they create their own problem codes. And that allows you to see some of the things that are interesting around code. It gives you a little bit more protection because it's not just CVEs that they look into, but also in addition, just kind of framing their research. They're looking at things that are maybe even scary that don't necessarily have a CVE rating yet. So it can be quite interesting. Now, from a red team perspective, this data is actually super interesting because a shift left element of a red team practitioner is that they're looking for things that could be exploitable so that they can find a way to actually demonstrate that the code that's actually being deployed is weak in a variety of ways. So from the anti-engineering perspective, looking at something like this, I might actually start to analyze and say, well, from a red team perspective, that Commons Collections library looks to be really interesting. What could I do with it? And generally what that leads to in most environments is that you can do things like build up POCs. A POC is a proof of concept. On the breaker side, even breakers actually write code. They just write code that basically does things to applications that it shouldn't be allowed to do. And so sometimes there are mistakes that are built into applications. There is no such thing as perfect software. And I think that what's really interesting is that when we talk about shift left, there's this concept within the community around that we're going to build things to be more perfect earlier on. And what I would tell you is actually what you want to do is you want to find mistakes faster within your pipeline, highlight them, and be able to get to fixing those mistakes that might provide opportunities to bad guys. Now, what I will also tell you is we tend to spend a lot of time as a red team in the red area of these charts. And the reason why is because those commonly are the areas where you might find exploits within an environment and not just have to patch something to patch it, but actually really leverage the ability to patch things that are most important. So when something's rated critical, it's probably going to have a exploitable POC that can actually create a way for a bad guy to be able to break into your systems, your software, gain access to data. And those are bad things that we all want to prevent. So you can imagine as you're looking through this, it's really easy to prioritize. A red teamer can leverage this just like an application developer. So now we actually have a way to have common language between a security team and an application team, which is just magic into itself. So why is that all important? Like as a red teamer, we get interested in different things. Back in the day when I started doing red teaming, it was all about how fancy could I be in breaking into something so that I could help build a bit of shock and awe, if you will, to get people to do the right things, because it was all about trying to bring the adversary to life because they're very difficult to find. In this case, you're seeing here a little bit of I said I like to do comic strips earlier on in this discussion. This is my view of how a customer or consumer might actually get to see what security looks like to them. And in this security facts label, because I was at the time looking at a nutrition facts label, I thought, well, why not? You can see that this particular application might be interesting. What's great about a label like this is that there's this notion of adversary interest. I kind of say that this is the notion that when a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, did the tree actually fall? And the reason why that's an interesting concept is that we have tons of different ways that an application could have mistakes or problems within it. And ultimately, what determines the risk associated with an application having a defect is that an adversary has to be interested and they have to want to do something with that particular opportunity to convert it into a compromise or a breach. And so that's something to keep in mind as you're thinking about how you might apply the code capabilities within Nexus. Now, we all know that it would be great to understand adversaries, and not everybody's going to spend a ton of time on the underground trying to figure out what an adversary is interested about. So what's really ideal is that the codes that the companies create around CVEs and research tend to lead themselves towards actual POCs that can be gathered by a red team individual and played against the company. So having a mental model and being able to really move forward with, say, a CVE that comes out of Nexus is about actually applying some frameworks. In this case, you could take the Lockheed kill chain model and then the MITRE CAPEC model and the MITRE ATT&CK model, kind of forge them all together. And ultimately, at some point, you might even leverage things like AIML to predict the targets that might be most interesting to an adversary so that you can test them ahead. This means that in your pipeline, you have to have the information associated with exploiting code that's already been created so that you have a pattern of being able to identify those targets and opportunities that a bad guy might use. So these are, how do you find a needle in a haystack? Sometimes it's really about how do you actually leverage the tools within the pipeline to be able to find those needles and ultimately highlight them so that they can be leveraged. Now, as a developer, what I love is that I can go to one place and actually look up what a red team view is of the code that actually might be within the libraries of my application. And sometimes what's really interesting about Nexus is there's a drill down feature, so you can see where dependencies might have dependencies that are actually foul as well. And so I think that that's really the benefit of being able to pull some of the security into a CI/CD pipeline, is that you have interest from the security community and you have an understanding because the tools actually bring security features and development features together into one place where it can be shared. I'm a big collaborator, and I like to collaborate on similar information so that you don't have to quite explain it all the time. That can actually lower the friction for the security team to continue to chase the actual things that might get exploited and highlight risks that are near term versus long term. When you're kind of looking at something in Nexus, the next thing to really think about is what does that really mean? You saw the Commons collections earlier within the Sonatype product, and there's a lot of companies out there that do research. One of them might be Fortinet, who at the time actually highlighted some of the Commons collections capabilities that were under attack at the same time that Sonatype found these things. And I think that's interesting because it tells you that there's interest in the community. You start to see it generate. It's not just that you have interest, but you also have the risk associated with whether or not that exploitable capability is something that's important. And then you can also find out where all that particular library is being used within every part of your application so that you can eradicate it and not necessarily see an exploit come to life when it could be hidden. And that's important because we see a lot of things like awesome CVE POC, where there's sort of a curated list of CVE POCs. And what I was saying earlier is that a POC is really a proof of concept exploit, where proof of concept exploits are actually a good way for a payload to be generated that shows and highlights that an application is vulnerable. So it's not just that you're going to find something, patch it, and then it's gone forever. I think that you have to have an artifact repository that helps you build a tree associated with that library to understand where all the places are that it could be, and then ultimately test your way through to get assurance that you don't actually have that code anywhere within your software. So we leverage things like this whenever we see something early on in the pipeline. If it gets patched, great. Sometimes patches take a while. And you might actually have to do something like V-patching, or you might even try to build an exploit to the next level so that you can test with it. Sometimes POCs don't do a full exploit. They actually just do an impaired exploit. That can be a scanner type of application. And so what we're always trying to do is kind of further it. And like I said, red team extreme so that we can try and get ahead of attackers. So that means you kind of build a hat trick within your environment. The hat trick here is really we put on the red hat, we figure out how we're going to break into something, we break into it, we prove it, and then we get it fixed as quickly as possible. Data's just not enough. Like you could be getting lots of information. Tends to be that for most security applications, you get billions of events that get correlated, analyzed, and ultimately with hundreds of defects that come out of that pipeline. I think that it's important because you're going to distribute, depending on how many lines of code that your company has, you're going to distribute those defects so that they can be worked, and the faster they're worked, the less likely the ROI of the bad guy is actually going to be realized, because ultimately you've eradicated that problem from becoming an opportunity. And like I said, we're adversary obsessed, which means you're caring about things like motive, method, and opportunity. And in motive, method, and opportunity, if you just cut off the opportunity, a lot of times you don't have to worry about the motive or the method because there's really no realization without the opportunity. I think it's also important to highlight some of the other talks that are out there in the industry. And, as I was thinking about doing this talk, I realized that there's a lot of stuff that's really interesting, and you can see some of the exploitable attack surface that's out there. There was a really great talk. I've left a link in here. I'll provide the slides. But I think DevSecOps Lessons at OWASP is just amazing. Lots of information. One of the things that we learned early on is that if you have 100 developers, they'll generally be matched up with about 10 operations staff and 1 security professional. And what I just showed you is that 1 security professional has to hold down a lot of different tools and capabilities to be able to be valuable in this pipeline. That's very challenging. And so what we have to do is figure out a way to distribute the security knowledge within the development pipeline so that developers can make better security decisions and that they understand the adversary intent that's out there for their application. one of the best questions to ask is how many adversaries does your application have? And I think that lessons like the ones at the OWASP talk that was leveraged here are really important because they're going to highlight what you really need to be thinking about when you're testing. Another one to highlight is back in 2015, there was a full stack attack at RSA talk that was presented by Veracode. Super interesting. And one of the greatest parts about it was that they actually did this thing around attack maps, where it's very easy for an application developer to, instead of building a threat model, be able to map out the places where they know they may have taken risks within their application. And as part of this, if you are measuring from the security side whether or not there's actual interest, you might put out things like honey keys or honey configurations or honey parts of your application libraries and really measure interest and gauge it. Back when we did this, you can see that a lot of the experiments that we did produced an outcome within hours. Escalation of privileges took about 5 days, and I'm not sure why it took that long for somebody to escalate privileges, but the environments were all very cloudy, so that could have been why. Ultimately, what's great about this is that you see things like hours back then, but now it's really moments. A lot of the adversary capabilities have really started to become applications unto themselves, services where you can actually run them to be able to find things like exposed API keys or username password combinations. And so you see things like account takeovers. So this is a great talk where I think that if you're interested in learning more about how to actually hack a full stack, this was a great presentation. And then
heads up, we got a couple minutes left.
Yep, I'm almost done. And then the security hierarchy of needs at RSA, which is basically the security hierarchy needs, is around how do you make application security and software security easier for a developer quickly so that they can be good at it. 80% of most problems associated with an attacker come into these 5 areas. So if you were to put something in front of a developer and you said, hey, if you just got these 5 areas right, you get 80% of the problems eradicated from your software. These are the 5 that we leverage. So zoning and containment, asset management, logging, authentication, and encryption. And I left a bunch of the links in here. This one was presented in 2017, and I believe it was also recorded, so very worth watching. Finally, if nothing else, I would say collaborate, 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 get into a community. One of the communities that I run is devsecops.org. The DevSecOps Days group is up and running now, so that's super interesting. And I would just say get involved, participate, science the heck out of things. Even look towards building payloads for some of the POCs out there, because the faster we test our code and eradicate opportunities, the better. That's all I have for today. Thank you. I'll be on Slack for a while.
All right. Great. I've got a little info here. So there's one I want to ask, and it has to do with how far ahead of the curve you usually are. You know, you were 2 or 3 years ahead of the curve on DevSecOps, and now you've started with the adversary. You've really become obsessed in the last 6 months to a year, and it's starting to notice. Do you think that's the next level we're working towards?
Yeah, I think we're kind of on a 4 and 5 scale now with DevSecOps at Intuit. So we're doing things like adversary return rate. We're looking at and really beating up our code a lot more aggressively. I do think it's the next thing. And I think if you're not actually looking at adversary interest, you're probably missing the boat. Like, I think that it's great to build security into your pipeline, but ultimately the thing that's going to help you to tune your pipeline, and I'm being specific about that word, tune your pipeline, is around understanding adversary intent and interest, because then you might even be able to hone your skills towards making things more resilient within certain areas where adversaries are finding opportunities. And I think the last piece is really finding your ideal victim and really eradicating the opportunities that are presenting themselves most.
All right, great. Thank you. You can say hi to your friend Damon. He's sitting there.
Hi, Damon. Nice to see you.
So, Damon, come on in, say hi.
Hey, how's it going?
That's good. Shannon, you know, it's always, I miss seeing you around. So I hope that we get to see you more often when I'm in San Francisco.
I will see you soon, I'm sure.
Also, if you could, in the chat room, when you go to the Slack room, if you have any recordings you want to point to, or you do talk about adversary, I want to see those.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Great. All right.
There's going to be a lot more coming this year, so I plan on sharing.
All right.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.